This is Sarah and Shannon. We're doing our project on Salisbury, the Houses of the Close. Okay, so going into the introduction of the book, it talked a lot about the history and foundation of the Close, which is where we're going to start. So Salisbury was originally constructed and eventually consecrated in 1092 under Bishop Osmond, and he was kind of what gave them the original episcopal lands that allowed them to build the original cathedral. He also wrote a constitution, and his institution of 1091 is what it was based off of, and this is kind of the precedent for the other English cathedrals that became the source of the great prestige, or the main sources of the Foursquare Constitution. So Salisbury was one of the 9 cathedrals that was served by secular canons, and the canons didn't really live like the monks. They lived in their own houses, and they could hold personal possessions, and they were able to hold one or more estates and prebends that belonged to the chapter. By 1217, there was as many as 52 or 53 canons living within Salisbury. So Bishop Roger was really who kind of started expanding out the original cathedral. He added on to the east, but he had a disgrace in 1139 that kind of made it so that Salisbury and the current town were having friction, and so they needed to move the cathedral. So the new site of Salisbury was moved, and they had a 9-mile area, and it was approved by Herbert Poor, who was one of the bishops of Salisbury, and underneath his brother it was actually kind of formed and brought to fruition. And because of the long period of time that it took to build the new cathedral, it allowed plenty of time to plan. It was one of the most successful towns in the early 13th century, and they were able to move the town to a place where they wanted more room and more privacy for the Close, and they have a river that bords the west side of the Close that allowed them to have kind of more self-sustaining system. So in 1219 and 1221 they started to hold annual fairs, and it was allowing them to kind of gain money and prosperity to help the Close kind of keep going. By the 1400s, they were one of the half-dozen most prosperous towns in England, and by the 15th century, they were one of the 3rd most richest. So the Close occupied a lot of the south-lying part of the site and stood separate and independent from the town. So the new town was kind of built on a grid system, and it allowed water channels to kind of go down the center of the streets. And it allowed for them to kind of have a system of how they were set up and kind of a planning process. So it was originally kind of headed under Hubert Walter, who was the Dean of York, and he was appointed at Salisbury in 1189. And he kind of had this grandiose project idea, and kind of the layout of Salisbury is mostly owed to him. But it was under Herbert and Richard Poor, as I mentioned before, that kind of got Salisbury to where it was in the building process. So Herbert, who was the Archbishop from 1194 to 1217, kind of started the planning process, and then Richard, who was the dean from 1199 on, succeeded him as bishop and achieved the foundation after 20 years of laying kind of the formation of the new cathedral. There was really a delay because of lack of money, and it was exacerbated by the turmoil in the church and the state of affairs under King John. Richard, when he became the bishop, was able to have a very successful conclusion of the cathedral because of the planning that he was able to lay. So from 1217 to 1219 it was quickly raised. So when the Close was founded, the first building was the bishop's house, or known as the bishop's palace. It went through a lot of change throughout the centuries, and Elias de Derham came in as one of kind of the main architects to build the bishop's palace and kind of help design it. So the removal from Old Sarum was symbolically completed in 1226 when the remains of Bishop Osmond and Jocelyn were brought to the new cathedral. So the Close occupies over 83 acres, and it was really planned methodically, as we said before, with the grid system. But there was a lot of unequal sizes when they got to actually building the houses, because there's a lot of different levels of wealth that went into it. So the Close was consecrated in 1258, and it was eventually finished over the next 2 decades, but there was a lot of change happening through the rest of the centuries. In the inventory it talks a lot about new things being added, things being changed, and kind of having to trace it back through the centuries. So the occupants of the Close, as we've heard before, were primarily the bishop, the canons, and the 4 dignitaries. Salisbury, Lincoln, and Wells were the three largest secular cathedral chapters, and Salisbury, York, and Lincoln were the richest. Salisbury was kind of unusual though because the bishop was also considered one of the canons, and so he was able to have more leeway in what he was able to do in the cathedral. So kind of the houses of the closed were paid for by the clergy individually, and so they had an ownership of the house, and so there's kind of a hierarchy that went with the houses where the older ones were able to choose the better houses that were perceived to be better places to live, and then the younger ones kind of had to go with what they were left, and then as it kind of rotated through, they were able to upgrade to the new houses, which kind of goes into these different levels of wealth that they had. So within the house of the close, there were halls, which was the largest room in every canonry. It was a setting for the canonical people to show their hospitality. It was usually in a position parallel to the road and opposite of the main gateway of the house. And it had upper rooms that were apartments for the house guests, and there were also chapels attached so that every canonry had one, and it was usually for the canons to use. But it allowed travelers and things to come in and have a place to stay on their journey. But the lower rooms of the canons' houses were kind of less easily understood because there's a lack of height, similarity, and a lack of original features. Some of the rooms are 8 feet high and some are 12 feet high. And so there's kind of a speculation of could they be parlors or wine cellars or porter's rooms, all sorts of things that they're trying to, nobody really knows what they originally might have been because of different changes that happened to them. So by the 15th century, there were new rooms being kind of built in that were allowing for more accommodation and more comfort, but they were more varied. And this is kind of seen through more windows and fireplace and latrines being kind of added into these houses. And in this time period, we also have more documents that allow us to see what's happening with the closed houses and how they're changing. I don't know where I'm going from here. The principal chambers were expanded upon in this time to allow for more guests, and so it made it so that they needed more private rooms, and so they kind of added on to the houses of the close that they had the larger chambers for the guests to be in, and it allowed for more lodging and outbuildings, which were appearing through the 15th century. And then there were smaller houses along the northeastern area of the close, but only 4 of them actually remain, and none of them are complete. They may have been larger, but nobody really knows. So within the close, there's a lot of different building materials and details that were happening. There's a lot of use of stone and in the way that they're constructed. Most of the walls are stone and everything. Most of the old stones come from Old Sarum. A lot of them do, and so you can see the carvings in the walls from the old buildings. And this happens, you can see them in the closed wall in the old cathedral, and they kind of just appear everywhere in all the different buildings. And it's a symbolic gesture of the continuity that goes into Salisbury from Old Sarum to their new location. And it's kind of a valued commodity that they have this going on. So there's a lot of different changes through the centuries as well that the inventory points out. Like there's windows and doorways that change in the shape of them. Some go to archways, to more square ideas. And then there's an increasing amount of chimneys and fireplaces, which were kind of uncommon until about the 15th century when they were being more added into the closed houses. There's a use of timber where all the frames of them were made of timber, but they were usually not exposed. And there's a lot of old floorboards and doors that are kind of refurbished and changed throughout the close. There's also different types of roofs that are made throughout the centuries, so if you look at the different roofs going through Salisbury, they kind of change over the centuries. So you can kind of see the history that the inventory goes towards, because every item in the inventory talks about its history as it's going forward. There's a lot of deco detail that is going on, like in this, which is the Malmesbury house. There's a lot of plaster detail that's happening within the houses. and kind of this ornate style that's happening. So that kind of leads up to our time frame with Shannon.